The Roosevelt Middle School cafeteria falls into shocked silence as a woman in civilian clothes strides through the entrance, flanked by uniformed military personnel displaying Department of Defense credentials. Officer Blake Hutchinson's confident smirk vanishes as he recognizes the black woman he dismissed as just another angry parent during the disciplinary meeting 30 minutes earlier. "Good afternoon, staff and students," Colonel Maya Washington announces, her voice carrying unmistakable military command authority throughout the cafeteria. "I'm Colonel Maya Washington, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. Some of you may not recognize me without my dress uniform, as I've been operating as a concerned parent while investigating the treatment my daughter received at this school." Her eyes lock onto Hutchinson, who has gone pale. "Officer Hutchinson, I believe we need to discuss why you body-slammed my 14-year-old daughter Destiny to the ground and cuffed her for disrespecting authority when she asked why she was being detained, and told witnesses that kids like her need to learn their place in the system." The gathered students and faculty freeze in recognition. The school resource officer who 30 minutes ago had treated her like a powerless parent now faces the special operations commander whose daughter he just brutalized, and his career in law enforcement is about to end under military oversight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 days earlier, Colonel Maya Washington had been reviewing intelligence briefings at Fort Jefferson Army Base when she received an urgent call from Roosevelt Middle School that would force her to choose between her classified military responsibilities and protecting her daughter from institutional abuse. At 38, Washington commanded the 75th Ranger Regiment's most elite Special Operations Unit, responsible for counter-terrorism missions that required absolute secrecy and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. Her 12-year military career had taken her from West Point to Afghanistan to classified operations across 3 continents, building a reputation for tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The irony that she would need those same protective instincts to defend her daughter from American law enforcement hadn't been lost on her. Washington was a single mother by choice, having adopted 14-year-old Destiny when the girl was 7, after Destiny's biological parents were killed in a car accident. The adoption had been facilitated through military family services, and Washington had navigated the challenges of raising a child while maintaining operational readiness for deployments that could last months without contact. Destiny Washington was everything her adoptive mother could have hoped for: academically gifted with a 3.9 GPA, socially conscious with involvement in student government and debate team, and mature beyond her years due to the unique circumstances of being raised by a special operations officer. She understood that her mother's work was important and often dangerous, and she took pride in the discipline and integrity that military life had instilled in their household. What neither Washington nor Destiny had anticipated was that the greatest threat to the teenagers' safety wouldn't come from international terrorists or foreign adversaries, but from a school resource officer in their own community who viewed black students as inherent threats requiring aggressive control. Officer Blake Hutchinson had been Roosevelt Middle School's resource officer for 3 years, assigned there after 6 years of patrol duty that had generated multiple excessive force complaints involving minority suspects. The school district had requested his transfer after community complaints about aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods, viewing school assignment as a less controversial role where his firm approach might be channeled more appropriately. But Hutchinson had brought his street policing mentality into the educational environment, treating adolescent behavioral issues as criminal justice problems requiring physical force rather than disciplinary guidance. His presence had transformed Roosevelt from a learning environment into a pipeline to prison system, where minor infractions resulted in arrests, citations, and physical confrontations that traumatized students and destroyed their educational trajectories. Principal Robert Lawson had hired Hutchinson enthusiastically, believing that visible law enforcement would deter student misbehavior and create an atmosphere of order that would improve academic performance. What actually resulted was an environment where students lived in constant fear of arbitrary punishment. Teachers lost authority to resolve conflicts through educational methods, and the school-to-prison pipeline accelerated as normal adolescent behavior became criminalized. The previous semester, Hutchinson had arrested 17 students, 14 of whom were Black or Latino, despite the school's demographics being only 40% minority. His reports consistently characterized routine teenage behavior as aggressive, threatening, or disrespectful to authority, language that justified arrests for activities that would have warranted counseling or detention in previous years. Vice Principal Nancy Burke had become Hutchinson's primary enabler, deferring to his expertise in handling problem students and supporting his recommendations for arrests rather than in-school discipline. Her complicity had institutionalized police authority over educational authority, making Roosevelt function more like a detention facility than a middle school. The incident that would bring Colonel Washington into direct conflict with institutional racism began with Destiny defending a classmate from what she perceived as discriminatory treatment during lunch period. Mara Williams, Destiny's best friend, had been accused by cafeteria supervisor Mrs. Dorothy Green of cutting in line and speaking disrespectfully. Allegations that Destiny had witnessed were false and motivated by Green's obvious irritation with Black students' presence in the cafeteria when Destiny politely intervened to explain that Amara had been standing in the correct position and had spoken respectfully. Green had called it backtalk and summoned Officer Hutchinson to handle what she characterized as disruptive behavior, requiring police intervention. Hutchinson had arrived with the aggressive posture that characterized all his interactions with students, immediately escalating the situation by demanding that both girls submit to detention without explanation of what rules they had violated. When Destiny asked what specific school policy justified their detention, a reasonable question, reflecting the critical thinking skills her mother had taught her, Hutchinson interpreted the inquiry as challenging police authority. What followed was a use of force incident that would have been excessive if applied to an adult criminal suspect, let alone a 120-pound 8th grade honor student whose only crime was asking questions about her rights. Ms. Crystal Thompson, an English teacher with 20 years of experience, had witnessed the entire interaction from her position monitoring the cafeteria during lunch duty. She had watched Hutchinson escalate from verbal commands to physical force within seconds, slamming Destiny to the ground with sufficient violence that other students screamed in horror and several began crying. Thompson had immediately begun recording with her cell phone, understanding that documentation would be crucial for protecting both the student and herself from potential retaliation for challenging police authority in the school environment. The video she captured would become crucial evidence, but more immediately, it would provide Colonel Washington with undeniable proof that her daughter had been victimized by excessive force that violated both constitutional protections and basic human decency. As Washington had raced from Fort Jefferson to Roosevelt Middle School, her mind had shifted from mother protecting her child to special operations commander, assessing threats and planning tactical response. She understood that confronting police brutality would require the same strategic thinking and decisive action that characterized her military missions. What she hadn't anticipated was that Officer Hutchinson would compound his initial misconduct by treating her as just another angry parent whose concerns could be dismissed and whose authority could be ignored. The school resource officer who thought his badge made him untouchable, was about to discover that he had brutalized the daughter of someone whose federal authority vastly exceeded his local police jurisdiction and whose commitment to protecting the innocent had been forged in combat against America's deadliest enemies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya Washington arrived at Roosevelt Middle School 23 minutes after receiving the call about Destiny's disciplinary incident, deliberately maintaining civilian appearance to assess the situation without triggering defensive responses from school officials who might alter their behavior if they realized they were dealing with military authority. She entered through the main office, where receptionist Carol Jensen informed her that Destiny was being held in the vice principal's office pending resolution of a serious behavioral incident involving law enforcement response. The clinical language was designed to make police brutality sound like routine. Disciplinary procedure, Vice Principal Nancy Burke greeted Washington with condescending sympathy designed to position the school as patient authority dealing with a problematic student and difficult parent. Mrs. Washington, thank you for coming so quickly. Destiny was involved in a cafeteria disruption that required police intervention. Officer Hutchinson had to use appropriate force to ensure safety and order. The framing, characterizing excessive force as appropriate and brutality as safety, immediately activated Washington's tactical assessment of institutional threat. Burke was already constructing narratives to justify unjustifiable actions. What specifically did my daughter do that required police force? Washington asked, her voice carrying the controlled precision that her soldiers recognized as prelude to decisive action. Burke consulted notes that appeared to be scripted rather than observational. Destiny was disruptive during lunch, interfered with cafeteria operations, and became confrontational when Officer Hutchinson attempted to address the situation. She refused to comply with lawful orders and had to be physically restrained for everyone's safety. Each element of Burke's explanation was either false or deliberately misleading. Disruptive meant defending a friend from discrimination. Confrontational meant asking questions about her rights. And physical restraint sanitized violent assault against a minor. I'd like to see my daughter immediately, Washington stated, her tone making clear this was not a request subject to administrative delay. Of course. But first, Officer Hutchinson needs to complete his incident report and discuss the charges that may be filed. He's the law enforcement authority in this situation, and we need to respect his professional assessment. The deference to police authority over parental rights was telling. Burke had abdicated educational responsibility to law enforcement, allowing a resource officer to determine whether students faced criminal consequences for school-related behavior. Officer Blake Hutchinson entered the conference room with the swagger that had characterized his approach to every interaction at Roosevelt. At 31, he had the muscular build of someone who used physical intimidation as his primary tool for establishing authority, and his body language communicated absolute confidence that his actions would face no meaningful consequences. Mrs. Washington, Hutchinson began without introduction. Your daughter created a serious disturbance in the cafeteria today. She interfered with my attempt to maintain order, questioned my authority, and became physically resistant when I attempted to detain her. I was forced to use appropriate control techniques to ensure safety. His description of events inverted reality. Destiny's questions about her rights became interference. Her reasonable inquiries became questioning authority, and her natural defensive response to assault became physical resistance, justifying escalated violence. Officer, what specific law did my 14-year-old daughter violate that justified physical force? Washington asked, giving Hutchinson opportunity to recognize the illegality of his actions. Ma'am, when students disrupt school operations and refuse to comply with police orders, that constitutes disorderly conduct and interference with law enforcement. I have discretionary authority to use necessary force to maintain order and ensure compliance. The circular reasoning was typical of police brutality justifications. Any questioning of authority became resistance. Any resistance justified force, and any force was retroactively appropriate because resistance had occurred. Washington's military training allowed her to recognize Hutchinson's psychological profile immediately, an insecure individual using institutional authority to compensate for personal inadequacies, willing to brutalize children to maintain the illusion of control. She had encountered similar personalities in military contexts, where they were quickly identified and removed before they could endanger missions or personnel. "I'd like to see the security footage of this incident," Washington requested, knowing that visual evidence would contradict Hutchinson's fabricated narrative. Burke intervened protectively. "School security footage is confidential and can only be released through proper administrative channels. Officer Hutchinson's report provides the official account of what occurred. The refusal to provide evidence while insisting on accepting police claims without verification revealed the institutional bias that enabled brutality. Schools protected officers while denying parents access to information about their children's treatment. Officer Hutchinson," Washington continued calmly, "did you consider alternatives to physical force? Did you attempt to de-escalate the situation through conversation? Did you evaluate whether a 120-pound eighth grader posed genuine threat requiring takedown techniques?" Her questions demonstrated tactical knowledge that should have made Hutchinson uncomfortable. But his experience with parents who lacked institutional power had made him overconfident in his ability to dismiss challenges to his authority. "Ma'am, I've been in law enforcement for 9 years. I know how to assess threats and use appropriate force. Your daughter's behavior escalated the situation to the point where physical control was necessary. If she had simply complied with my orders, none of this would have happened. The victim blaming was explicit. Destiny was responsible for her own brutalization because she had failed to submit to illegal authority without question. In Hutchinson's worldview, children had no rights that interfered with his convenience, and parents had no authority that superseded his discretion." Miss Crystal Thompson knocked on the conference room door, requesting permission to provide witness testimony about what she had observed. Her presence as an educator willing to challenge police authority made Hutchinson visibly uncomfortable. "I recorded the entire incident," Thompson announced quietly. "I believe Mrs. Washington should see what actually happened to her daughter, the existence of video evidence that contradicted. Hutchinson's report should have prompted immediate reconsideration of the official narrative. Instead, both Burke and Hutchinson reacted with hostility toward the teacher who had documented their misconduct. "Ms. Thompson, recording students without permission violates privacy policies," Burke stated disapprovingly, "and your involvement in this meeting is inappropriate." The school's protective response to evidence of brutality revealed that institutional loyalty superseded student welfare. They would rather punish the teacher who documented abuse than address the officer who committed it. Washington realized that she was dealing with systematic institutional failure that required federal intervention rather than local administrative resolution. The school and police had constructed a system where brutality was protected and evidence was suppressed, making accountability impossible through normal channels. As she prepared to reveal her military authority and federal jurisdiction over civil rights violations, Washington understood that Hutchinson and Burke had made the tactical error of assuming she was powerless to challenge their authority. They were about to discover that they had brutalized the daughter and dismissed the concerns of someone whose federal authority made their local institutional power seem insignificant by comparison. The conference room tension escalated dramatically when Washington requested to see her daughter immediately. only to be told that Destiny was being held in a separate room until the situation was resolved and potential charges were determined. The deliberate separation of mother and child demonstrated the institutional power that school and police officials wielded over families they perceived as lacking recourse. Mrs. Washington. Vice Principal Burke continued with false sympathy. "We understand your concern, but Officer Hutchinson needs to complete his investigation. Destiny's behavior today was serious enough that criminal charges are being considered. We're trying to handle this matter internally if possible, but that requires your cooperation and understanding of the gravity of the situation. The veiled threat was clear: accept the official narrative, or face criminal prosecution of a 14-year-old honor student whose only offense was defending a friend and asking questions about her rights. Officer Hutchinson added his authority to the intimidation. "Ma'am, I've been very patient today, but your daughter committed disorderly conduct, interference with a police officer, and resisting arrest. Those are serious charges that could affect her educational future and college prospects. I'm willing to consider lesser charges if she accepts responsibility and you demonstrate appropriate respect for the disciplinary process." The quid pro quo was explicit. Acknowledge that brutality was justified, or watch your child face criminal charges for being victimized. Hutchinson had used this intimidation tactic successfully with other parents who lacked resources to challenge his authority effectively. Washington's military training had prepared her for exactly this type of psychological warfare. Adversaries who use threats against innocents to compel cooperation from protective figures. Her response was calculated to appear compliant while actually gathering intelligence about the institutional failure she was documenting. Officer, I want to understand exactly what happened so I can help Destiny learn from this experience, Washington said, adopting the submissive tone that Hutchinson expected from parents he was manipulating. Could you walk me through the sequence of events that led to physical force being necessary? Hutchinson, interpreting cooperation as validation of his authority, provided detailed description of his misconduct with the confidence of someone who believed his actions were legally and morally justified. Your daughter was in the cafeteria causing disruptions with another student. When I approached to investigate, she became argumentative and questioned my authority to maintain order. I gave her multiple opportunities to comply with my directions, but she continued being disrespectful and resistant. When I attempted to escort her to the office for disciplinary action, she pulled away and became physically confrontational. I had to use control techniques to prevent the situation from escalating further. Each element of his account was either false or deliberately distorted. Causing disruptions meant defending a friend. Questioning authority meant asking about her rights. Resistant meant being confused about what she was accused of. And control techniques sanitized violent assault that had traumatized witnesses. Ms. Crystal Thompson, still present despite Burke's disapproval, interrupted with factual correction. That's not what happened. I watched the entire interaction. Destiny was polite throughout. She asked what school rule she had violated, which is a reasonable question. Officer Hutchinson escalated to physical force within 30 seconds, without giving her opportunity to comply with anything, because he never specified what compliance would look like. Her contradiction of the official narrative infuriated both Burke and Hutchinson, who viewed teacher testimony as inappropriate challenge to administrative and police authority. Ms. Thompson, you're not trained in law enforcement procedures, Hutchinson replied dismissively. Civilians often misinterpret appropriate police tactics as excessive because they don't understand threat assessment and control techniques. Your perspective, while well-meaning, doesn't reflect the reality of what I observed and the decisions I had to make in a dynamic situation. The condescending explanation that brutality appeared excessive only to those who didn't understand proper policing was Hutchinson's standard deflection when witnesses challenged his use of force, Burke supported her officer. "Ms. Thompson, Officer Hutchinson has extensive training in youth behavioral management and law enforcement procedures. While we appreciate your concern for students, his professional assessment of the situation carries more weight than civilian observations, the institutional deference to police. Authority over educational judgment demonstrated how thoroughly law enforcement had colonized school discipline, making educators subordinate to officers in their own buildings." Washington recognized that she was witnessing the systematic, institutional protection of misconduct that made accountability nearly impossible through normal channels. Both Burke and Hutchinson felt secure in their authority because they had successfully used intimidation and institutional bias to suppress previous challenges to their practices. "Officer Hutchinson," Washington said carefully, "I noticed you mentioned Destiny pulled away when you attempted to escort her. Can you describe specifically how you interpreted that as requiring takedown techniques rather than additional verbal direction?" The question demonstrated tactical knowledge that should have made Hutchinson reconsider his audience. But his experience with parents who lacked institutional power had made him overconfident in his ability to manipulate any civilian. "Ma'am, when suspects resist physical direction from law enforcement, that constitutes assault on a police officer and requires immediate control response to prevent escalation. I couldn't allow your daughter to believe that defying police authority was acceptable behavior. The force I used was minimal and appropriate. For gaining compliance, his characterization of a 120-pound eighth grader as a suspect who assaulted him by instinctively reacting to unexpected physical contact revealed the militarized mindset that treated all civilian interactions as potential combat situations requiring aggressive response. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, Roosevelt's school counselor, entered the meeting at Burke's request to provide professional assessment of Destiny's behavior. Her role was to add psychological credibility to the narrative that Destiny was problematic rather than victimized. "I've reviewed Destiny's file," Dr. Mitchell began, "and while she's academically successful, there are some concerning patterns. She's described by teachers as strong-willed and questioning, which can manifest as defiance in structured environments. Today's incident may reflect underlying authority issues that need to be addressed through counseling and disciplinary reinforcement, the psychological pathologizing of normal adolescent development, reframing curiosity as defiance and critical thinking as authority. Problems provided academic veneer for blaming the victim rather than examining institutional practices." Washington listened to the coordinated narrative construction with growing recognition that she was dealing with institutional conspiracy to protect brutality through victim blaming, evidence suppression, and expert manipulation. As the meeting continued with Burke and Hutchinson becoming increasingly confident that they had successfully managed another challenging parent, Washington made her tactical decision. The situation required immediate federal intervention rather than continued intelligence gathering. The school officials, who thought they were manipulating a powerless parent, were about to discover that they had brutalized the daughter of someone whose military authority would make their local institutional protection seem irrelevant. While Colonel Washington endured condescending manipulation at Roosevelt Middle School, her missed communication check-in at Fort Jefferson had triggered a comprehensive military response that would converge on the small school with overwhelming force projection capabilities that local officials couldn't imagine. Major Scott Davis, Washington's executive officer, had been monitoring routine operational communications when the colonel failed to respond to scheduled contact protocols. Washington's position required precise adherence to communication schedules due to her access to classified counter-terrorism operations, and any deviation triggered immediate security assessment. Colonel Washington missed her 1,400 hours check-in, Davis reported to Brigadier General Frank Torres, commanding officer of the Special Operations Training Command. She's never missed scheduled contact in 3 years of stateside assignment. We need to assume potential compromise or emergency. Within 20 minutes, a response team was mobilizing, military police investigators, JAG officers specializing in civil rights violations against military personnel, and Pentagon liaisons with authority to interface with civilian law enforcement when military interests were threatened. General Patricia Coleman, Washington's direct superior and one of the Army's most decorated female combat veterans, received briefing about the situation while reviewing counterterrorism intelligence at the Pentagon. Washington's unit was scheduled for deployment to classified operations within 6 weeks, making any threat to her security a matter of national security concern. A middle school resource officer assaulted Colonel Washington's daughter? Coleman asked incredulously, processing information that seemed too absurd to be credible. He had no idea he was dealing with a special operations commander's family. Correct, General. Officer Blake Hutchinson used excessive force against Destiny Washington based on what appears to be routine school discipline escalation. Colonel Washington is currently being manipulated and intimidated by school officials who assume she lacks institutional recourse. Major Davis explained, the situation presented unprecedented challenges. Protecting Washington's family required revealing her military status, but doing so could compromise operational security for ongoing classified missions, where her cover identity as a civilian contractor was crucial for intelligence gathering. Meanwhile, at Roosevelt Middle School, other students who had witnessed Hutchinson's brutality were being systematically intimidated into silence through threats about their own disciplinary records and academic futures. The institutional pressure to suppress testimony demonstrated how thoroughly the school had been militarized under police authority. Tyler Johnson, a 7th grader who had attempted to help Destiny after she was slammed to the ground, was called to the principal's office and warned that spreading rumors about the incident could result in suspension for disrupting school operations through false statements. The message to potential witnesses was clear: challenge the official narrative and face academic consequences that could damage college prospects and family relationships. Ms. Crystal Thompson, whose video recording had captured the incident, found herself under administrative pressure from Principal Robert Lawson, who suggested that teachers who created problems for school law enforcement might find their contract renewals difficult to justify during budget discussions. Crystal, Officer Hutchinson provides valuable security services for our students, Lawson explained during what was nominally a routine evaluation meeting. Teachers who undermine that relationship by second-guessing police procedures may not be the right fit for Roosevelt's educational environment. The retaliation threat was designed to suppress the video evidence that contradicted official claims about Destiny's treatment, demonstrating how institutional power protected misconduct through witness intimidation. But Thompson had already shared the recording with Reverend Michael King, a community activist who had been documenting patterns of police brutality in Oakdale's schools. King recognized the footage as evidence of systematic civil rights violations that required federal intervention beyond local administrative processes. This isn't just excessive force, King told attorney Rachel Adams, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in police misconduct cases. This is part of a broader pattern where school resource officers are criminalizing normal adolescent behavior, particularly when black students are involved. Officer Hutchinson has been doing this for years, while administrators provide institutional protection. Adams began immediate legal preparation for federal civil rights lawsuit, understanding that video evidence of police brutality against a minor would generate significant public pressure for accountability that local institutions couldn't suppress through typical intimidation tactics. What none of the civilian advocates knew was that their routine police misconduct case was about to become a military justice issue requiring coordination between federal agencies with authority that vastly exceeded local law enforcement jurisdiction. Back at Fort Jefferson, Colonel Thomas Reed from the Judge Advocate General's office was reviewing legal frameworks for military intervention when civilian authorities violated the civil rights of service members. Dependents. The Posse Comitatus Act limits military involvement in civilian law enforcement. But we have clear authority when military families are targeted for civil rights violations, Reed explained to the response team. Officer Hutchinson's assault on Colonel Washington's daughter and the subsequent intimidation of the family constitute federal crimes against military dependents that trigger our jurisdiction. The legal analysis confirmed that local police brutality against military families was not just civilian criminal justice issue, but matter of military security requiring federal oversight and potential prosecution under Uniform Code of Military Justice. In the addition to civilian courts, intelligence analysts at Fort Jefferson had been conducting background investigation of Officer Hutchinson and discovered troubling patterns that suggested Destiny's brutalization was part of systematic discrimination rather than isolated incident. Hutchinson has 17 excessive force complaints over 6 years, with 14 involving minority students, reported Captain Diana Cruz, military intelligence officer assigned to the case. His transfer to school resource officer was punishment for civilian complaints about his street policing, but administrators treated it as appropriate placement rather than addressing his pattern of misconduct. The intelligence assessment revealed that Roosevelt Middle School had become a dumping ground for problematic officers whose agencies wanted to avoid accountability while maintaining their employment, creating an environment where brutality against children was institutionally enabled rather than deterred as multiple military agencies coordinated response to protect one of their elite commanders and her family. Officer Hutchinson was completing paperwork documenting his successful resolution of a disciplinary incident, confident that his authority would protect him from any consequences for brutalizing a child. He had no idea that within hours, the Roosevelt Middle School cafeteria would be occupied by military personnel with federal authority that made his local police jurisdiction seem insignificant, or that the difficult parent he had dismissed was actually someone whose colleagues possessed investigative capabilities and legal powers that would end his career and potentially his freedom. Colonel Maya Washington sat in Roosevelt Middle School's conference room, maintaining her civilian cover while internally shifting to the strategic mindset that had made her one of the Army's most effective special operations commanders. The institutional conspiracy to protect Officer Hutchinson's brutality while intimidating her family had reached the threshold where military intervention was not just justified, but operationally necessary. She activated her secure communication device with a seemingly casual glance at her phone, sending coded message to Fort Jefferson. Package compromised. Authorization requested for full disclosure and federal intervention. Timeline immediate. The response came within 2 minutes. Authorization granted. Federal assets en route. Maintain position until arrival. General Patricia Coleman herself was leading the military response, understanding that brutality against the families of special operations personnel represented threats to national security that required decisive federal action rather than local administrative resolution. While Washington maintained her cover, the federal convoy was already approaching Roosevelt Middle School. Military police vehicles, JAG officers with federal jurisdiction over civil rights violations against military families, and Pentagon liaison with authority to coordinate with civilian law enforcement when military interests were threatened. Vice Principal Burke, still confident in her institutional power to manipulate what she perceived as a powerless parent, continued the intimidation campaign. Mrs. Washington, We're prepared to handle this matter internally if you demonstrate appropriate cooperation. But if you continue questioning Officer Hutchinson's professional judgment, we may have no choice but to pursue formal charges against Destiny. Her threat crystallized the institutional protection system. Accept brutality as justified or watch. Your child faced criminal prosecution for being victimized. Officer Hutchinson added his authority to the psychological warfare. Ma'am, I've been very accommodating today, but your attitude is becoming concerning. Parents who refuse to accept responsibility for their children's behavior often find themselves dealing with more serious consequences. I'd hate for this situation to escalate beyond what's necessary. The implicit threat was that Washington's failure to submit to his narrative could result in her own arrest or additional charges against Destiny, exactly the intimidation tactics he had used successfully against other families who lacked institutional recourse. Washington made her tactical decision. Officer Hutchinson, I appreciate your patience. Before we proceed, I should mention that I'll need to contact my supervisor about taking additional time off to handle this situation. My work requires very specific scheduling, and missing meetings can create complications. The seemingly innocent comment was actually operational preparation, establishing cover for the federal intervention that was about to arrive, while giving Hutchinson false confidence that she was capitulating to his authority. That's sensible, Burke replied approvingly. Taking time to reflect on today's events and discuss appropriate responses with family and employers often helps parents understand the seriousness of these situations. Her condescending approval revealed complete confidence that their intimidation had successfully manipulated another challenging parent into compliance. At 2:47 p.m., exactly 93 minutes after Washington's initial arrival, the federal response team entered Roosevelt Middle School's main office. The presence of uniformed military personnel, federal marshals, and DOJ attorneys with Department of Defense credentials created immediate alarm among staff who had never imagined their routine school day would involve federal law enforcement. Principal Robert Lawson, summoned from a meeting with district officials, approached the federal team with visible confusion and growing concern. "I'm Principal Lawson. Can I help you? This is highly unusual for a middle school." Major Scott Davis, Washington's executive officer, presented formal notification. "Principal Lawson, we are here regarding an incident involving Colonel Maya Washington's daughter, Destiny Washington, who was assaulted by your school resource officer approximately 2 hours ago. Colonel Washington is a U.S. Army Special Operations Commander currently meeting with your staff about civil rights violations against her family. The revelation that they had been dealing with a military commander rather than a powerless civilian. Parents sent shockwaves through the administrative staff. Several office workers stopped their activities to process that federal authorities were investigating their school for brutalizing a military family." "There must be some mistake," Lawson replied weakly. "Mrs. Washington is just a parent dealing with her daughter's disciplinary issues. We weren't informed about any military connection." Colonel Thomas Reed from JAG stepped forward with legal documentation. "Principal Lawson, Colonel Washington was operating under civilian cover for operational security reasons. Your resource. Officers' assault on her daughter and subsequent intimidation of her family constitute federal civil rights violations against military dependents, triggering our jurisdiction under multiple federal statutes. The expansion from local school discipline to federal military justice investigation demonstrated how thoroughly Hutchinson's brutality had escalated beyond civilian administrative resolution." In the conference room, Washington's secure phone displayed incoming message, "Federal team on site. Authorization to reveal status and assume command granted. She looked up from her phone to find Burke and Hutchinson watching expectantly, assuming she was arranging time off to deal with their manufactured crisis. "Officer Hutchinson, Vice Principal." "Burke," Washington began, her voice subtly shifting from deferent parent to commanding officer. "Before we continue, I should clarify something about my background and the resources available to address today's incident." The change in her tone was immediately noticeable. Gone was the submissive uncertainty they had been manipulating, replaced by unmistakable authority that neither school official recognized, but both instinctively responded to with increased attention. "I'm not just Destiny's mother," Washington continued, rising to her full height and allowing her natural command presence to emerge. "I'm Colonel Maya Washington, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. I've spent the past 2 hours listening to justifications for brutality against my daughter while being treated as a powerless parent who could be intimidated into accepting civil rights violations." The revelation hit both officials with visible physical impact. Burke's confident demeanor collapsed entirely, while Hutchinson's face showed dawning recognition that his routine intimidation tactics had been directed at someone with federal authority vastly exceeding his local police jurisdiction. "There are federal agents in this building right now," Washington informed them, "investigating civil rights violations against military dependents. Your assumption that I lacked institutional recourse was your tactical error." The power dynamic had reversed completely. The school officials, who had been manipulating what they thought was a vulnerable parent, now faced a special operations commander whose federal colleagues possessed investigative capabilities and legal authority that made their local institutional protections irrelevant. As Washington prepared to confront the officer who had brutalized her daughter and the administrators who had enabled him, she understood that the tactical patience she had demonstrated while gathering intelligence was about to be replaced by the decisive action that characterized her military leadership. The swift escalation from local school discipline to federal criminal charges demonstrated how thoroughly Officer Hutchinson's brutality had transcended civilian administrative jurisdiction and entered military justice territory. Student witnesses, who had been intimidated into silence by administrative threats, began entering the conference room as word spread that federal authorities were investigating the incident. Tyler Johnson, the 7th grader who had attempted to help Destiny, approached General Coleman with visible relief. "General, ma'am, I saw everything," Tyler said, his voice gaining confidence as he realized he was protected by federal authority rather than threatened by school retaliation. Officer Hutchinson threw Destiny down so hard that everyone started screaming. She wasn't fighting or being mean, she just asked what she did wrong. It was scary, his testimony, delivered in front of military officers rather than school administrators, who had threatened him for potential rumor spreading, provided additional witness evidence that contradicted every element of Hutchinson's fabricated incident report. Amara Williams, Destiny's best friend, whose defense had triggered the entire incident, stood up from where she had been quietly observing. "They told us not to talk about what happened, or we'd get in trouble too. But Destiny was just trying to help me when that cafeteria lady was being mean. She didn't do anything wrong except ask questions." The revelation that witnesses had been systematically intimidated into silence demonstrated institutional conspiracy to suppress evidence, rather than investigate misconduct, a pattern that suggested Roosevelt had protected Officer Hutchinson's brutality multiple times previously. Officer Hutchinson, realizing that his standard intimidation tactics had not only failed but had been documented by federal authorities, made one final attempt to minimize his culpability. "General Coleman, I want to emphasize that I followed standard police procedures for maintaining order in a school environment. If my actions seem excessive in retrospect, that reflects the challenging nature of school resource officer duties, not inappropriate use of force." his continued adherence to the false narrative, despite video evidence and multiple witness testimonies contradicting his claims, demonstrated either genuine inability to recognize his misconduct or deliberate commitment to lying regardless of consequences. Colonel Washington stepped forward, her military bearing now unmistakable, as she addressed the officer who had brutalized her daughter. "Officer Hutchinson, I've served in combat zones where rules of engagement required more restraint against armed enemy combatants than you showed against my unarmed 14-year-old daughter. Your standard procedures constitute war crimes if applied to prisoners of war, yet you used them against an American child in her school." The military comparison made the excessive nature of his force undeniable. If such tactics were prohibited against enemy soldiers, they were certainly illegal against American students. Burke attempted one last deflection. "Colonel Washington, General Coleman, I want to emphasize that Roosevelt Middle School supports our military families completely. Any misunderstanding about today's events stems from communication failures, not institutional bias against military dependents. Her framing of systematic brutality and intimidation as misunderstanding and communication failures revealed complete inability to acknowledge the gravity of what had occurred or take responsibility for institutional failures that had enabled it." General Coleman's response was definitive. "Vice Principal Burke, there's no misunderstanding here. You have a resource officer who assaults children and administrators who protect him by intimidating families and suppressing evidence. That's not communication failure. That's systematic civil rights violation that requires federal intervention." JAG Colonel Reed announced immediate federal action. "This school is now under federal investigation for systematic civil rights violations against students and intimidation of military families. Officer Hutchinson is terminated effective immediately and will face federal prosecution. Vice Principal Burke is suspended pending investigation of her role in enabling misconduct and intimidating witnesses." The swift personnel actions demonstrated federal commitment to immediate accountability rather than lengthy administrative processes that might allow continued misconduct or evidence destruction. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, the school counselor who had attempted to pathologize Destiny's normal behavior as authority issues, realized her complicity in victim blaming and attempted to distance herself. "General, I want to clarify that my assessment was based on incomplete information provided by school administrators. If I had understood the full context of the incident, my evaluation would have been completely different." Her backtracking revealed how easily educational professionals could be manipulated into providing academic credibility for discriminatory narratives when they relied on administrative accounts rather than independent investigation. Major Davis addressed the assembled school personnel. "Everyone in this room needs to understand that what happened today represents federal crimes against a military family. But more importantly, it represents the systematic abuse of children that violates basic constitutional protections regardless of their parents' military status." His statement expanded the accountability beyond military interests to broader civil rights principles that protected all students from police brutality in educational settings, as federal agents prepared to escort Hutchinson from the building in handcuffs, the same restraints he had applied to Destiny. Students who had witnessed the morning's brutality gathered in the hallway, their presence serving as silent testimony to the community impact of his misconduct. Destiny Washington, who had been held in isolation for hours while her mother was manipulated and intimidated, was finally brought to the conference room where she ran into Washington's arms with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong," Destiny sobbed. "I just asked why I was in trouble and he hurt me really bad. Everyone was watching and I was so scared." Her testimony, delivered to a room full of military officers, school officials, and federal attorneys, captured the human cost of institutional brutality against children, trauma that extended far beyond physical injury to psychological damage that could affect her relationship. With authority figures for years, Colonel Washington held her daughter while addressing the assembled officials. "This is why we're here, not because she's a military dependent who deserves special protection, but because she's an American child who deserves constitutional treatment. Every student in this school should be safe from the brutality that my daughter experienced." The maternal protectiveness, combined with military authority, created a powerful synthesis. Personal stake in protecting her child expanded into institutional commitment to protecting all children from similar abuse, as Hutchinson was led away in handcuffs. His final statement to news cameras revealed his complete failure to understand the gravity of his actions. "I was doing my job protecting students and staff from disruptive behavior. If holding students accountable is now considered assault, then schools can't maintain order." Effectively, his framing of brutality as accountability and constitutional violations as maintaining order demonstrated the mindset that made such misconduct possible, viewing children as potential threats requiring aggressive control rather than young people deserving protection and guidance. The transformation was complete. The Special Operations Commander, who had been dismissed as a powerless parent, now watched the officer who had brutalized her daughter face federal prosecution, while her military colleagues implemented reforms that would protect all students from similar abuse. The morning after Officer Hutchinson's arrest, General Patricia Coleman convened an unprecedented joint military-civilian accountability meeting in Roosevelt Middle School's auditorium, ensuring that the response to police brutality against military dependents would be public and transparent, rather than handled through closed administrative processes. The auditorium was packed with military personnel, school district officials, city leadership, community members, parents, and students who had witnessed the previous day's dramatic federal intervention. Local media covered what had become a national story about a special operations commander's response to her daughter's brutalization by school police. Yesterday, one of our elite military commanders discovered that her daughter had been assaulted by a school resource officer while she was meeting with administrators who attempted to intimidate her into accepting false narratives about the incident, Coleman began, addressing an audience that included Superintendent Margaret Hayes and the 7-member school board. This wasn't just personal injustice against a military family. It revealed systematic failures in how this school district handles police misconduct and protects students from institutional abuse. Superintendent Hayes, realizing that her district faced potential federal oversight, loss of military-based partnerships, and reputational damage affecting property values and business development, attempted immediate damage control. General Coleman, the district deeply regrets this incident. We're committed to comprehensive reform to ensure military families and all students receive appropriate protection and respect. Her political response avoided, acknowledging the systematic nature of the problem, prompting JAG Colonel Thomas Reed to provide uncomfortable clarity. Superintendent Hayes, this wasn't an isolated incident. Our investigation identified 12 previous cases over 3 years where Officer Hutchinson used excessive force against students, with 11 involving minority children. The pattern was visible to anyone reviewing complaints objectively. School Board Chair Dr. Patricia Morris, facing potential federal receivership that would strip local control over district operations, announced immediate reforms. Effective today, Officer Blake Hutchinson is permanently banned from any school district property. Vice Principal Nancy Burke is terminated. Principal Robert Lawson is suspended pending investigation. We're eliminating school resource officer programs, district-wide until comprehensive accountability measures are implemented. The swift personnel and policy actions demonstrated recognition that protecting problematic employees would trigger federal intervention that could destroy local autonomy entirely. Reverend Michael King, representing affected families from the broader community, addressed the military and civilian officials. We appreciate these initial steps, but parents in this district have been reporting police brutality in schools for years, while being dismissed as overprotective or biased against legitimate discipline. Today's accountability only happened because the victim was a military commander's daughter. What systemic changes will protect students whose parents lack institutional power? His challenge forced authorities to confront whether reforms would benefit all students, or just those with families possessing federal authority to demand accountability. Colonel Washington, accompanied by Destiny, whose courage in speaking truth to authority had triggered the comprehensive investigation, testified about their experience. I've served in combat zones where we had clearer rules about appropriate force against potential threats than Officer Hutchinson applied to my daughter in her school cafeteria. Military discipline is about precision, proportionality, and protection of those under our authority, values that should apply even more strongly to children in educational environments. Her comparison between military rules of engagement and school policing highlighted the absurdity of allowing resource officers to use force against students that would be prohibited against enemy combatants. Ms. Crystal Thompson, the teacher whose video documentation had provided crucial evidence, addressed the institutional retaliation she had faced. I was threatened with contract termination for recording police misconduct against a student. That intimidation was designed to suppress evidence and protect brutality rather than children. Educational professionals need protection when they document abuse, not punishment for refusing to be complicit in covering it up. Her testimony revealed how institutional culture had prioritized protecting misconduct over protecting students, creating environments where brutality could flourish without documentation or accountability. Attorney Rachel Adams announced comprehensive legal action. We're filing federal civil rights lawsuits on behalf of 13 students who experienced excessive force from Officer Hutchinson over 3 years. Additionally, we're seeking consent decree requiring federal oversight of the district's disciplinary practices and police policies. The goal is institutional transformation that prevents future abuse rather than just individual compensation. The civil litigation added financial pressure to moral and legal obligations for reform, ensuring changes would be sustained beyond immediate crisis response. Tyler Johnson, the 7th grade witness who had been intimidated into silence before federal protection arrived, spoke directly to school officials. You told us not to talk about what Officer Hutchinson did to Destiny or we'd get in trouble. That made us feel like we were bad kids for knowing right from wrong. Students shouldn't be afraid to report when adults hurt other students. His testimony demonstrated how witness intimidation had created culture of fear that protected abuse while teaching children that challenging authority was dangerous, even when that authority was criminal. Major Scott Davis outlined military-civilian coordination protocols. Fort Jefferson will establish liaison office with this school district to ensure military families receive appropriate protection and that any future misconduct against military dependents triggers immediate federal investigation. We're also providing constitutional policing, training to all district security personnel. The ongoing military oversight demonstrated federal commitment to preventing future incidents rather than just responding to crises after they occurred. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, the school counselor who had attempted to pathologize Destiny's normal behavior, publicly acknowledged her role in institutional victim blaming. I provided psychological justification for disciplinary actions without independently investigating what had actually occurred. That professional failure enabled abuse to be characterized as appropriate response to student problems. I take full responsibility for contributing to systematic bias against students who needed protection. Not pathologizing, her accountability modeling helped other staff members recognize their complicity in protecting misconduct through professional passivity or active enabling. The accountability meeting concluded with concrete structural changes. Federal oversight for 3 years, mandatory civil rights training for all personnel, elimination of subjective disciplinary categories that enabled discrimination, establishment of student advocate positions with authority to challenge administrative decisions, and civilian review board with subpoena power to investigate complaints. General Coleman announced that Colonel Washington's response would become case study taught at military academies and staff colleges. Colonel Washington demonstrated how military leaders should respond when civilian institutions fail to protect our families through strategic assessment, tactical patience, decisive action, and comprehensive follow-through. Her approach will be studied as model for military-civilian interface when institutional accountability is required. As the meeting concluded, students who had been terrorized by Officer Hutchinson approached Colonel Washington to express gratitude for exposing abuse they had experienced but felt powerless to challenge. Alone, thank you for believing us and having the power to do something about it, one student told her. We knew what he was doing was wrong, but nobody listened before you came. Washington's response emphasized collective responsibility. You were brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered. The change happened because witnesses like you, teachers like Ms. Thompson, and advocates like Reverend King refused to accept abuse as normal. I just had the institutional authority to act on what you had already proven. Over the following 8 weeks, Roosevelt Middle School and the broader Oakdale School District underwent the most comprehensive transformation in their history, implementing changes that would serve as a national model for protecting students from police brutality while maintaining school safety through constitutional means. The Federal Civil Rights Compliance Office, established at Roosevelt under Department of Justice oversight, was directed by Dr. Angela Martinez, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in institutional reform following civil rights violations. Her mandate was to rebuild school discipline systems from the ground up, ensuring that student safety was achieved through educational methods rather than law enforcement intimidation. We're not just removing bad actors, Dr. Martinez explained during the first district-wide training session attended by all 847 school personnel. We're building systems that make misconduct organizationally impossible to sustain. Every disciplinary decision will be tracked demographically, reviewed by civilian oversight, and evaluated for constitutional compliance. The training wasn't optional or superficial. All employees underwent 80 hours of civil rights education, with quarterly refreshers and immediate retraining triggered if their disciplinary actions showed demographic disparities or constitutional violations. Mrs. Crystal Thompson, promoted to Director of Student Advocacy after her courage in documenting police brutality, implemented revolutionary accountability measures throughout the district. Every disciplinary action was now video recorded, required written justification citing specific policy violations, and underwent peer review before implementation. Transparency protects everyone, Thompson explained to newly hired staff. When discipline is documented and reviewable, students can't be abused secretly. Parents can't be lied to about what happened, and good educators can't be pressured into enabling misconduct through silence. The systematic documentation eliminated the secrecy that had allowed Officer Hutchinson's brutality to continue for years without effective challenge or accountability. Colonel Maya Washington, whose military expertise had been crucial for exposing institutional failures, worked with Pentagon liaisons to develop comprehensive protocols for protecting military dependents in civilian educational settings. The Washington Protocol required immediate federal notification when military children experienced police contact in schools, with mandatory investigation if force was used or criminal charges considered. Military families serve our nation with the understanding that we'll protect their children while they protect our country. Washington explained during a Pentagon briefing that was later distributed to all military installations. Civilian institutions that abuse military dependence undermine national security by destroying the trust that effective military service requires. Her framework elevated protection of military students from individual advocacy to institutional policy that would safeguard thousands of military children across the country. The Student Safety Commission, established with authority independent of school administration, included student representatives, parents, community members, and civil rights experts with power to investigate complaints, subpoena records, and recommend personnel actions up to and including termination for constitutional violations. Tyler Johnson, the seventh grader who had been intimidated for witnessing Hutchinson's brutality, was elected as the student representative, his experience providing crucial insight into how children experienced adult authority in educational settings. Students know when adults are being unfair or mean, but we usually don't think we can do anything about it, Tyler told the commission during its first public meeting. Having official ways to report problems and knowing that adults will listen makes school feel safer for everyone. The student voice in institutional oversight ensured that reforms addressed actual problems rather than adult assumptions about what children needed for safety and learning. Reverend Michael King's community organization received federal funding to provide legal assistance and civil rights education to all district families, ensuring that future incidents would involve informed parents who understood their rights and could effectively challenge inappropriate enforcement. Knowledge equals power in school disciplinary situations, King explained during community education sessions. When families know their constitutional rights and documentation requirements, administrators can't manipulate them through intimidation or false information about their children's treatment. This legal education leveled power imbalances that had previously allowed schools to suppress accountability through parent confusion about rights and procedures. Officer Blake Hutchinson, meanwhile, had been convicted on federal civil rights charges and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for police brutality in a school setting. His conviction established legal precedent that excessive force against students triggered serious federal consequences, regardless of the educational context. School environments don't provide immunity for constitutional violations, Federal Judge Margaret Chen stated during sentencing. Children deserve greater protection from abuse, not less, and those who exploit positions of authority over minors face enhanced penalties that reflect the vulnerability of their victims. The harsh sentence sent clear messages to law enforcement nationwide that brutalizing students carried career-ending and freedom-threatening consequences that made constitutional compliance professionally essential. The district's new disciplinary framework eliminated subjective categories like disrespect or defiance that had given officials unlimited discretion to punish students they disliked. All disciplinary actions now required documentation of specific behaviors that violated clearly defined policies, with appeal processes that included civilian review and student advocacy. Dr. Martinez worked with child psychologists and education experts to develop discipline approaches that addressed behavioral issues through counseling, conflict resolution, and educational support rather than punishment and exclusion. Adolescent behavior that disrupts learning requires educational responses that help students develop better choices. Dr. Martinez explained to administrators learning the new framework. Criminalization of normal developmental challenges destroys students' futures without addressing underlying issues that caused problems. The educational approach to discipline replaced the criminalization model that had treated children as potential offenders rather than young people needing guidance and support. Data analysis 6 months into the reforms showed remarkable improvements. Disciplinary referrals decreased by 58% district-wide, with the steepest reductions in categories that had previously shown racial disparities. Student satisfaction surveys indicated measurably improved perceptions of fairness and safety, while academic performance increased as students focused on learning rather than avoiding arbitrary punishment. Constitutional compliance doesn't hinder educational effectiveness. Superintendent Hayes acknowledged during a national conference where Oakdale's reforms were presented as best practices. Protecting students' rights created environments where learning and development could flourish without fear of institutional abuse. The statistical validation of constitutional approaches contradicted claims that student safety required sacrificing civil rights, protections, or educational values. General Patricia Coleman visited Roosevelt 6 months after the initial intervention, finding hallways filled with student artwork, collaborative learning spaces, and adults interacting with children through mentorship rather than surveillance. This is what happens when institutions prioritize protection over punishment, Coleman observed during her walkthrough. Students are safer, learning is more effective, and the community trusts schools to nurture children rather than criminalize them. 8 months after Colonel Maya Washington's dramatic revelation at Roosevelt Middle School, she returned for the district's first annual Student Rights and Safety Day, a celebration of the comprehensive reforms that had transformed Oakdale schools from institutions of fear into environments of learning and protection. The transformation was visible throughout Roosevelt's campus. Hallways that had previously felt like prison corridors under Officer Hutchinson's regime now displayed student art, collaborative learning projects, and civil rights education materials. The militarized atmosphere of surveillance and punishment had been replaced by mentorship programs, peer mediation, and restorative justice initiatives. Dr. Angela Martinez, whose federal oversight had guided the institutional transformation, greeted Washington with visible pride in what had been accomplished. "Colonel Washington, I want to show you what constitutional education looks like when it's embedded in every aspect of school operations." She displayed the comprehensive accountability data that had become publicly available through monthly transparency reports. Disciplinary disparities that had previously shown clear racial bias had been eliminated entirely. The use of physical restraints had dropped to 0. Student satisfaction surveys indicated that 94% of students felt safe and fairly treated, compared to 61% before the reforms. When schools operate constitutionally, every metric improves, Martinez explained. Students learn better when they're not afraid of arbitrary punishment. Teachers teach more effectively when they're not enforcing discriminatory policies. Parents trust institutions that protect their children rather than criminalize them. Destiny Washington, now 15 and serving as Roosevelt's first student rights ambassador, had not only recovered from her trauma but had become a powerful advocate for other students experiencing institutional abuse. Her role gave her official authority to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, and ensure that reforms remained responsive to student needs. "Mom, I want to show you something," Destiny said, leading Washington to a display case containing the original incident report Officer Hutchinson had filed about her assault, alongside the actual video evidence and witness statements that contradicted his fabrications. "We keep this as a reminder that authority figures can lie and abuse their power," Destiny explained to a group of visiting students from other districts. "But we also keep it to show that truth and accountability are stronger than lies and intimidation when people have courage to document what really happened." Her mature perspective on institutional accountability reflected how the trauma of brutalization had been transformed into wisdom about systemic change and civic responsibility. Tyler Johnson, now in 8th grade, had become Roosevelt's peer mediation coordinator, helping resolve conflicts through dialogue and understanding rather than punishment and exclusion. His experience witnessing Hutchinson's brutality and being intimidated for speaking truth had motivated him to ensure other students had safe ways to address problems. Before Colonel Washington came, we were scared to report when adults hurt students because we thought we'd get in trouble too, Tyler told Washington during a peer mediation training session. Now we know that protecting each other is our responsibility and that good adults will support us when we tell the truth about bad ones. Ms. Crystal Thompson, whose video documentation had been crucial for exposing the brutality, was now Director of Student Advocacy for the entire district, training teachers nationwide in recognizing and reporting institutional abuse of students. The recording I made changed my entire understanding of professional responsibility. Thompson explained during a conference presentation that would be attended by 2,000 educators. Witnessing abuse and staying silent isn't professional neutrality, it's complicity. Education professionals have moral and legal obligations to protect students from institutional violence. Her transformation from passive observer to active advocate demonstrated how accountability processes could empower good people to challenge systems that enabled harm. The Federal Civil Rights Compliance Office had expanded beyond Oakdale to oversee similar reforms in 17 other districts where police brutality in schools had been documented. Dr. Martinez's framework was being studied by the Department of Education as a national model for constitutional compliance in educational settings. Attorney Rachel Adams had successfully negotiated a $4.2 million settlement distributed among the 13 students who had experienced excessive force from Hutchinson, with additional funds supporting ongoing oversight and civil rights programming. The financial compensation mattered for individual families, but the systematic reforms matter for all future students, Adams explained. We established legal precedent that school districts face serious liability when they enable police brutality against children, creating economic incentives for constitutional compliance. Officer Blake Hutchinson had served 2 years of his 4-year federal sentence when he was attacked by other inmates who learned he had brutalized children. The assault left him permanently disabled and highlighted how even criminal populations viewed violence against children as particularly heinous. His conviction had sparked similar investigations in 43 other districts nationwide, leading to the prosecution of 12 additional school resource officers for excessive force and the implementation of constitutional policing reforms in hundreds of schools. On Washington's final evening in Oakdale, she met with military families whose advocacy had built community support for the reforms. The gathering at Fort Jefferson included parents, students, and community members who had collaborated to transform their schools from institutions of fear into environments of protection. You did something that generals and politicians often can't accomplish, Dr. Martinez told Washington. You used institutional power to protect not just your own child, but all children. That's real leadership. Washington redirected credit. The courage came from students like Tyler, who told the truth despite intimidation. Teachers like Ms. Thompson, who documented abuse despite professional risk. And advocates like Reverend King, who refused to accept discrimination as normal. I just had the federal authority to act on what they had already proven. As Washington returned to her special operations duties, she carried with her evidence that American institutions could evolve beyond their failures when faced with sustained pressure, legal accountability, and moral leadership. The district, where her daughter had been brutalized for asking questions, now stood as proof that schools could operate constitutionally while maintaining safety. That discipline could be educational rather than punitive, and that protecting students' rights enhanced rather than hindered their learning and development. Most importantly, Roosevelt Middle School demonstrated that accountability wasn't just about punishing individual bad actors, but about building systems that prevented abuse, empowered good people to challenge misconduct, and prioritize protecting children over protecting institutions. The Special Operations Commander, who had been dismissed as just another angry parent, now saw those same hallways filled with students who understood their rights, teachers who would protect those rights, and administrators who viewed constitutional compliance as foundational to educational excellence rather than obstacle to institutional control. That transformation, from fear to safety, from criminalization to education, from abuse to protection, represented the kind of institutional change that made America's stated ideals about justice and equality more than aspirational rhetoric. And it had started with one mother's refusal to accept that her daughter's brutalization was acceptable, combined with the federal authority to demand accountability from institutions that had forgotten their obligation to protect rather than harm the children entrusted to their care. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.